Friends of Serpent Mound is the organization that hosts this festival each year. The Friends of Serpent Mound was an organization that was founded in 2004 through the Adams County Traveler and Visitors Bureau. At the time, the Ohio Historical Society, as they were known then, was going through a bit of a financial crisis, courtesy of the government of the state of Ohio cutting their budget allocation by 50%. And the second budget cycle, they cut it another 50%. And the third budget cycle, they cut it another 50%. And so over the course of about 5 years, they ended up laying off about 90% of their employees. And so they had over here just one manager and a guy to cut the grass. And the manager was in charge of managing 7 parks. And so Serpent Mound, Fort Hill, Davis Memorial here in Adams County, the Rankin House down on the Ohio River, Serpent Mound up by Bainbridge. He had all these parks that he was trying to manage. And so conditions at the park declined dramatically. They weren't keeping the museum open. And so Adams County Travel and Visitors Bureau set up a committee to put together an organization to try to help with what was going on at the park. Now, they've gotten through their financial crisis and they really don't need that help anymore, to help run the museum or any of that stuff. So they do that on their own. But we've continued to host various events throughout the years. And the Summer Solstice was the first event that we took over doing in 2004. And we've been doing it ever since. So it just keeps, kind of growing and getting bigger every year. Now, my interest in Serpent Mound came about largely because of my background in science. I used to teach physics and astronomy. I was a student at Eastern Michigan University when my best friend at the time and vice president of the astronomy club decided that one year for spring break, we were going to go to Cahokia outside of St. Louis to visit Cahokia because Cahokia has this thing called a woodhenge. And that was related to astronomy. And we had kind of an interest in prehistoric astronomy, being astronomers. And so we organized our trip. And he lived outside of Loveland, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cincinnati. And when we arrived from Michigan, he had something he had to do for the first day or so. And he said, I heard about this place out farther east of here called Serpent Mound. And it's supposed to have something to do with astronomy, but I don't really know. So, while you've got time to kill, why don't you go and visit? And I got, at the time, this is pre-internet days, got out the old paper transportation map from the state of Ohio, looked on the map and saw that there were other mounds listed on the paper map. So I decided, I could probably go and visit a bunch of these. And so on that day, I went to visit the Miamisburg Mound, Fort Ancient, Serpent Mound, Fort Hill, Serpent Mound, and Mound City in Chillicothe, and made it all the way to the Tarleton Cross Mound in one day. And Serpent Mound certainly captured my attention, and made a couple more trips to see it in the intervening years before finally meeting my wife in 2003 and moving down here in 2004. My interest has largely been stimulated because at the time, very little was known about the astronomical alignments at Serpent Mound. And so part of my sort of research efforts has been to understand them better, document them as fully as possible. And so we're going to kind of take you through some of those. But the whole reason that we do the Summer Solstice Festival is because Serpent Mound incorporates the sunrise and the sunset alignments within the design of Serpent Mound itself. And so we are here to just sort of celebrate that, celebrate the genius of those ancient Native American people who built it. And so let's talk about those ancient people. To give you a sense of the scale, the time scale of prehistory here in Ohio, from about 18,000 BC to about 8,000 BC, that period of time is known as the Paleo-Indian Period. And we know that people were here, living here, right here in Adams County during that period of time. Down on the Ohio River, in Adams County, just outside of the town of Manchester, a little bit east, upriver on the Ohio River, there's a place called Sandy Springs. And back in the 1970s, there were several archaeologists who documented that Paleo-Indian peoples lived at a place there, and it's now known as the Sandy Springs Archaeological District. And where that is located is essentially at the mouth of Brush Creek, Ohio Brush Creek, which is the same creek that runs just on the west side of Serpent Mound. So same creek, follow that creek right down to the Ohio River, and you end up at one of the oldest archaeological sites here in the state. Artifacts from that period of time have been found at Serpent Mound. When Serpent Mound was excavated by Harvard back in the 1880s, they collected lots and lots of different kinds of artifacts, and they found artifacts from every single period of time that we're going to talk about here. They found those at Serpent Mound. So from 8,000 BC to about 1,000 BC, archaeologists call that the Archaic period, and they have some divisions in there: early, middle, late Archaic period, ending in something that's known as the Glacial Came culture. Some people don't like the word culture, so they sort of say it's a proto-culture. It's hard to know exactly how to define that, but by the time those people were around, they began to ceremonially bury their dead in geologic features known as glacial cames, which were left over from the retreat of the glacier. Basically large mounds of gravel, and so those people began to bury their dead in those glacial remnants. It's unclear as to why they would have done that, but that's what they were doing. From about 1200 BC to 100 BC, that is the period of time that starts what archaeologists call the Woodland Period. And there is up here, the early and middle Woodland Period. It used to be known as the Adena Period and the Hopewell Period here in Ohio. And those terms have kind of fallen out of favor recently in the last maybe 5 to 10 years because of the use of the names. No one knows what these people call themselves. And because it's so old, even linguists who study prehistoric languages and try to reconstruct them, the earliest that any of the linguists have been able to reconstruct Algonquin, prehistoric Algonquin, what they call Proto-Algonquin, that only dates to about 500 AD. And so they can't even reconstruct what language people were saying to each other back then. But nevertheless, the name Adena comes from the excavation of a mound in the city of Chillicothe. It was on the property that the first governor of Ohio named Adena. He called his farm Adena and built a mansion there, and on his farm was this mound. Now, he had long since died, and somebody else owned the property, and they were going to bulldoze the mound. And so at the time, the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Society, as they were known then, went in and did an excavation. And the artifacts that they found there, they have then now attributed to a people. People were living a certain way of life. and they said, okay, this is a particular culture, and we're going to name it after the location where we excavated the mound, named Adena. Now, the guy who did that, Thomas Worthington, evidently found the term in some Freemasonic book, because he was a Freemason or something like that, and but it has sort of a Jewish biblical stem, and so it kind of goes back to refer to the Garden of Eden, Adena, Garden of Eden, and that's where that comes from. So it's not necessarily appropriate to call a Native American culture by some biblical name, so that's kind of fallen out of favor recently. The second one there, Hopewell, that is named after the guy that owned the farm that was excavated in 1892 for the Chicago World's Fair. The Chicago World's Fair hired the same guy who excavated at Serpent Mound in the late 1880s, a guy by the name of Frederick Putnam, to head up the anthropology pavilion that was going to be on exhibit at the Chicago World's Fair. And they gave him a bunch of money to send archaeologists across the country and down into South America and Central America, and they dug up all these archaeological sites, and everything that was excavated was put on display at the Chicago World's Fair. And one of the places they excavated is now known as the Hopewell Earthworks, named after Mordecai C. Hopewell, former Confederate war soldier who, after the Civil War, relocated to the outskirts of Chillicothe, Ohio, and bought the farm where the mounds were. And so it's named after former Confederate war soldier. Again, probably not appropriate. So nevertheless, those two cultures, Adena lasts until about, now they're kind of pushing it to even maybe 0 AD, and maybe even past that, maybe 50 AD. There's some evidence for that. Hopewell culture, though, they slightly overlap. And there's some people that think, well, maybe they're the same, and they just maybe changed what they were doing over time. But others think, no, they're fairly distinctive. So there's still an archaeological argument over all of that stuff. After Hopewell, there's a period of time here, it's kind of the late Woodland people, that lasts from about 600 AD or CE to 1000 CE. That is the intrusive mound culture, sometimes known as the intrusive burial mound culture. They got their name because they're basically only known by them burying their dead in mounds that had been built by the Adena and the Hopewell. They were already there, and they dug into them and buried them in the upper layers of a bunch of these mounds. There haven't really been any intrusive burial mound culture settlement sites that have been found and excavated, and so very little is kind of known about them. From about 1100 to 1600, that is very late Woodland culture. That is now known as the Fort Ancient culture, the Fort Ancient people. And then from 1600 to 1673, that's the late prehistoric or proto-historic, and that's where you start to get some evidence of tribal affiliations and living in certain areas before white people show up and start actually recording history as the way we write things down. It's not oral tradition history. It's a different kind of way of tracking that kind of stuff. And so, again, at Serpent Mound, artifacts have been found from this entire time scale. All right, so I don't know if you can kind of see that, but what do we know about when Serpent Mound was built? Well, back in 2011 and 2012, an archaeologist friend of mine by the name of Dr. William Romaine put together a project they called, simply enough, the Serpent Mound Project, in which he got a number of different expert archaeologists in various fields to come and lend their time and their efforts to do some investigations at Serpent Mound. Because in the 100+ years that the Ohio history, now known as the Ohio History Connection, has owned Serpent Mound. They have done very, very little archaeological efforts at Serpent Mound at all. There was one minor excavation in 1991, and then they put in a water line and did a long trench, but after the excavation of where that trench was going to go, in which they collected somewhere on the order of 10 to 12,000 artifacts, they never wrote a report. So, and they waited more than a decade before they even assigned anybody to even start cleaning the stuff. So that material has not been very well studied and still is sitting up there without any assessment today. Fairly recently, about 4.5 years ago, there was another project to remove some stairs that had been built into the tail of Serpent Mound. And so there was a sort of minor archaeological project in which they removed the upper layers of the stairs. They left the interior part of the stairs in the mound and just covered it over. But from that, they attempted to get some carbon dating. Unfortunately, they got all the carbon dating from the uppermost layers of the mound, which has been reconstructed. Serpent Mound, as you see it today, was reconstructed and sort of resurfaced by Frederick Putnam from Harvard University. And they built a fairly thick layer on top of it. They scraped up all the dirt on the side of Serpent Mound and piled it up and sort of amplified its size, both in height and in width. And when Putnam was here, he took the first pictures of Serpent Mound that we know of. And at the time, the tail was about this high off the ground. Okay. And so the core of the mound is somewhere down in there, way down here. Well, they only dug down 17 inches and removed the surface stairs, so they didn't get down to the core of the mound. And so all of that is just, really worthless stuff. In any event, William Romaine's project, they did a more comprehensive set of analysis, including carbon dating, in which they got Indiana University, who had expertise in this, to drill a core from the top of the mound all the way down until they hit bedrock. And they did that in 17 places along the body of the serpent. And as they did that, then they have all these cylinders in which they can see all the layers of soil, and where they found at the very base layer where the mound had been constructed on, they were able to get carbon from 7 of the cores. All of them came back with a median date of about 321 BC, which puts that into the early woodland or Adena era, right? And so when you go to Serpent Mound today, the historical marker reads that it was built by the Fort Ancient. Well, that really is outdated, and so none of the science has really changed over there. So trying to ignore that, read up on it on your latest scientific, stuff. So the people that built Serpent Mound built it in a very, very specific way. And that's what this talk is really about, is to talk about how the bends of the serpent and the way in which it's oriented points to all the key risings and settings of the sun during certain times of the year, and the moon, and possibly some other stuff, which I'll get to. All the ancient cultures that lived in Ohio left these remnants, as I indicated. But when Putnam did his excavations, which he was pretty thorough, he spent 4 summers excavating at Serpent Mound. I got access to Harvard's collections of all those artifacts, and I looked at every single one of them and got pictures of all of them, and spent time with artifact experts to identify the time frames that they all came from. Now, we decided not to look at the pottery shards because it's very difficult to identify pottery shards from photographs, but it's a little easier to do it with lithic and stone artifacts. So we did that for the lithic and stone artifacts, and it turns out that 40% of all the artifacts that were collected from Harvard dated back to the Archaic era, so older than Adena, and like by far the most significant number. So there's a huge Archaic, presence, that Serpent Mound, before the Serpent Mound that we know of today was constructed, right? And Serpent Mound is the largest remaining serpent effigy earthwork in North America. I did a project, I've done a talk on this, I think I did this talk maybe last year, in which I talked about all the other Serpent Mound effigies around the United States and Canada. I documented about 100 of them, and I think maybe the next slide has a map. Let me see. Yeah. So this might be a little hard to see, but I was able to map all of the serpent effigies across North America that I could find records of. The ones in green are earthen serpents. The ones that are kind of in white are made out of stone. And then there's a couple of brown ones there in the center in Kansas. Those are serpent intaglios. Now that phrase intaglio means instead of making an effigy of raised earth, they actually dug into the ground, and it's sort of the absence of that earth that creates that. That's an intaglio. And so there are a couple of those. And they often have a lot of the same characteristics that this Serpent Mound has in terms of astronomical alignments. Many of them have ovals in front, open jaws, all that kind of stuff. So they're fairly similar. None of them are the same, but they all have similar characteristics. And the oldest one that's been dated, there was a dating project of one of them, this white one down in Florida, that was dated to over 4000 BC. The most recent one that I found records of was a green one up in Minnesota that was documented as being built in the 1870s. Okay, so that's a fascinating subject, but nevertheless, there are lots and lots of Serpent Mound effigies around. So it's actually just outside of Chicago, along the Des Plaines River, and it's in a nature preserve. They don't have signage up for it, but it is preserved. I visited it, I think, 4 times now, and they are kind of leery about signing it because I think they are afraid that somebody will dig into it and loot it or whatever. You have to kind of know where it is. It's off the beaten path, but yeah, it's still there. Yes. So this is the number per state. If you live in a different state, you can maybe see Wisconsin has the most intact ones and the most reports of any that we know of.
Where's the one in Indiana?
So there's one, it's kind of in eastern Indiana. Yeah.
I was going to say, are the 2 in-ground ones in Kansas, are they still there?
Yes. Yeah. There's one on the shores of a place called Rice Lake, and another one south of there. The one south of there has been fairly well documented since the early 1980s. An archaeologist by the name of Clark Malum did some amazing archaeological work on that particular serpent effigy. The other one's more recent. It was discovered, I think, around 1988, and they call it the Sage Serpent because it was found on a hill, like just at the bottom of a hillside of wild sage, and so that's how it got its name. But
How deep are they? How big are those ones?
so they're both smaller than this Serpent Mound. I would say the larger of the two is about maybe 300, 400 feet in length. Serpent Mound here, if you just measure in linear distance without following all the contours, it's about 800. So this is about twice the size. Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what is archaeoastronomy. Archaeoastronomy is the study of how ancient peoples understood what they viewed in the sky. and how they incorporated that into their culture, their everyday culture. Archaeoastronomy is a multidisciplinary sort of subject. Archaeology, anthropology, statistics, probability, history, and of course astronomy methods are all used in that. The term archaeoastronomy was first used by Elizabeth Beatty in 1973, but the methodologies that were pioneered were before that. Alexander Thom and Gerald Hawkins over in England really pioneered the early sort of study of archaeoastronomy. For those that have been around a while, you might remember Gerald Hawkins as the guy that figured out that Stonehenge had astronomical alignments in the late 60s. He wrote a book called Stonehenge Decoded. All right, so Hawkins was kind of an early pioneer of those methodologies. And what happened as a result of that, because Hawkins was not an archaeologist, he was a mathematician, the archaeological community went ballistic, and they decided to begin to hold conferences to try to shoot down Hawkins's work. And so what emerged were two conferences at Oxford University, which they eventually issued two different reports. Based on the color of the outside of the book, they are known as the green archaeoastronomy methods and the brown archaeoastronomy methods, because one book had a green cover and the other book had a brown cover. And so the green one was Archaeoastronomy of the Old World, basically Europe. And then the brown one was the Archaeoastronomy in the New World, North and South America. And the methodologies used by the two different camps are slightly different. The archaeology of the New World incorporated Native American oral traditions into their analysis, whereas the people over in Europe were like, nah, we're just looking at the statistics of this. And they basically were all about the math and the precision of the alignments and so on and so forth. And so there's been sort of this schism all along about archaeoastronomy methods, and they still fight that stuff out, you know. But archaeoastronomy in Ohio didn't really start until 1982. And in 1982, two non-archaeologists, a philosopher and a mathematician from Erasmus College, Roy Horn and Ray Hively, set out to blow apart Gerald Hawkins's theories about and methodologies of Stonehenge. And what their hypothesis was is, well, you could take any site and you can find these sort of alignment lines. And so because they were here in, the Midwest, they selected the Newark Earthworks to test their hypothesis that Hawkins was full of rubbish. And so they went over there and they began surveying the Newark Earthworks, and they were surveying the sight lines, and lo and behold, guess what they found? They did have archaeoastronomy alignments built into its design, and they could not show that those methodologies were incorrect, and that their paper on that opened up the world of archaeoastronomy here in the United States, and particularly here in Ohio. And after that, William Romaine has sort of taken up the torch. He began to come out to Serpent Mound because he believed that Serpent Mound was likely to have those kinds of astronomical alignments. But the real problem was that nobody had ever mapped Serpent Mound accurately. And what he discovered was really important for figuring that stuff out. I'm going to go back one here. Did I skip that? I went back the wrong way. Here we go. He discovered this true north-south line, and he had to go out at night to observe Polaris to figure out where true north was, because we live in a meteor crater here at Serpent Mound, And because of the meteor crater, there are all kinds of weird magnetic anomalies in the crater, and it messes up people's compasses. And so he had to do it the old-fashioned way, going out there and really figure out where the center of the sky is and where true north is. And that's what he did, and he figured out that true north line. Okay, and so after that, it kind of opened things up for really rigorous study of astronomy at Serpent Mound. But in my archive research, I found that somebody may have already figured out at least one of the alignments as far back as 1929. I found this in a newspaper in Hamilton, Ohio, the Hamilton Evening Journal, about the Boy Scouts coming out to Serpent Mound and visiting Serpent Mound. And when they were here, it just so happened that it was around the time of the summer solstice. And there's that little paragraph down there that I've highlighted in red, which I'm going to blow up here for you to read. It says, the head of the serpent, whether by accident of contour or by design, points directly to the setting sun at the summer equinox. Okay? So the first alignment found was by the Boy Scouts. Okay? And people promptly forgot all about this and really didn't pay any attention to it whatsoever. But this is a Lidar survey of Serpent Mound. I was the first one to use Lidar for archaeology here in the state of Ohio. My background at Eastern Michigan, I got my master's degree in general science, and my master's thesis was mapping data from the Lunar Prospector mission. I did that under a NASA grant, in which I mapped data that was being returned from that mission. And so I had a bit of a mapping data analysis background. I did a lot of work on, Landsat imagery and stuff like that. So I had heard that the federal government had given the state of Ohio a bit of a grant to test some new technology. The Department of Transportation in Ohio got a grant to map all of the state highways using this new technology called Lidar, which is essentially light infrared. You fly over in a plane, you shoot a laser down to the ground, some of that material reflects back up to a sensor on the plane, you capture that data, and then you can map it. And it gives you elevation, it gives you latitude and longitude, it gives you the reflectivity, so you can remove things that you don't want, like buildings and trees. You can remove all this stuff, and that's what I did here. And so, for instance, Bill Romaine, when he created his map, he created the most accurate map in 1987, and he did it with about 700 to 800 data points of getting out there with the surveyor people looking through the telescope at some guy holding the pole and figuring out the elevations and all that stuff. So, most accurate map with 700 to 800 data points. This map right here, I don't know if you can see it down at the bottom, 223,296 data points. So it was accurate to within several centimeters. It picks up even the asphalt pathway elevation all the way around the mound. And so this really opened up and really solidified, being able to figure out accurately where things are pointed. And by removing the trees, it's very helpful in figuring out other things. So I put Bill Romaine's north line on there, and I'm going to show you that first summer solstice sunset line, and now all the other alignment lines that we are aware of for the sun. Okay, so let me stand up here and try not to shake the screen. So we have this alignment from the notch in the back of the neck straight through the center of the oval to the horizon. That is what's happening over the course of the next several days. It'll happen each night of the sun coming down on that alignment. There is an additional summer solstice alignment, which people are generally unaware of, and that is this bend in the Serpent, which is fairly close to where the observation tower is. That also points parallel, essentially, to the same point on the horizon. So you get the summer solstice sunset there twice. You have a summer solstice sunrise, which is bending, this bend here, going this direction to the eastern horizon. And then you have winter solstice sunrise, equinox sunrises, so both autumn and spring. Same thing, autumn and spring sunset, and winter solstice sunset. This is the most recent discovery. I did that in 2015, where I had a hypothesis that if you stood here and you looked right through the center of the tail, that would point to where the sun would set on the horizon for the winter solstice, and we documented it thoroughly, and so that's the most recent one.
So the two summer solstice ones,
Yeah.
the one at 300.6,
Mhm.
that's why the difference? There was just a...
Yeah, because they're slightly off, right, from one another, based on their angle.
So you did them at different times? Or no, they're still the sunsets, but they're
Yeah.
just done at two different years?
Yeah, these were all discovered at different points in time,
So they
and
were-
I'm gonna talk about who made those discoveries here in a second.
Yeah, that's cool.
All right, so the first real documentation outside of the Boy Scouts for this summer solstice sunset right here was by a husband and wife team, Clark and Marjorie Hardman, and you won't be surprised to find out that they are not archaeologists. They were not even astronomers. They were dowsers. And Clark Hardman Jr. had done some archaeoastronomy work at a site down in Florida where he lived. It's called the Crystal River site. Anybody ever heard of that? It is sort of on the west side of Florida, on the Gulf side. It's where the manatees go to spawn up the Crystal River. And there's this great sort of pyramidal site, multiple flat top pyramids that are all made out of shells. And they have found Hopewell era artifacts at that site, but nevertheless, Clark Hardman had done some archaeoastronomy analysis of that site, and then he decided to turn his gaze, for whatever reason, to Serpent Mound. And so they made a map of Serpent Mound about the same time that Romain was making his map of Serpent Mound, and they were the first ones to publish that alignment. Romain was actually working on the lunar alignments at the time. Now, these over here, these sunrise alignments, summer solstice and equinox and winter solstice, those were identified by two amateurs, Robert Fletcher and Terry Cameron. They pitched the OHC on a project saying that they thought that there might be something there, and they identified those and published their paper. And then some of the other ones, I remember talking with Terry Cameron about, well, why did you only do the sunrise alignments? And he said, well, it's because we couldn't see through the trees to do the sunset alignments. Well, you don't necessarily need to do that, because if you go in the spring before the leaves come out, you can see the equinox alignment. Well, that's what I did, and so I documented those on the sunset side starting in 2005. So 2005, 2010 to 2014 were the ones that I worked on. Bill Romain put together a lot of the statistics and identification of the exact degree measurements, and he published a fully comprehensive map in 2014. And so that's where we sort of stand. Now, what we're talking about is, this is using a single point. This was from the Department of Astronomy, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. They put this little nice cartoon graphic together. So the sun does not come up along the horizon at the same point every single day. So along the eastern horizon, it will move throughout the year. Every single day it moves a little more and a little more and a little more, and then once it reaches its northernmost point, that's where we are now, the summer solstice. And then it turns around and starts going back south and goes all the way to its southernmost point. That's the winter solstice. And so that's what this is sort of documenting. But the red lines up there is saying, well, the moon does the same thing too. The moon's cycle, though, is not an annual cycle like the sun's cycle. It takes 18.6 years to complete its cycle of northernmost moonrise to southernmost moonrise. And so that's much more complicated to try to figure out. But nevertheless, Serpent Mound has those alignments as well, and Bill Romaine did a great job in documenting those. But this is with the Lidar, you can create a three-dimensional model, and so this is sort of looking towards the east from the west, looking at sort of a profile view of Serpent Mound, Brush Creek down at the bottom down there in blue. And just to give you an idea of what those sunrise alignments would look like, there's where the sun would come up in each of those bends. So summer solstice, the equinox sunrises, winter solstice, right? And the lunar ones are essentially the same. So you have minimum northern moonrise, moon midpoint rise, maximum southern moonrise. Now, for the last 4 years, I've been flying a high-end drone to take pictures of a lot of these from an aerial perspective, because the trees really hinder a kind of a view to be able to see all of it together. And so this is going to be some of these are going to be a little hard to see in this light, but here, Serpent Mound is down here, and you can see the center bend there points to where the sun rises on the vernal equinox. Okay, and I think I have a line there. There's your alignment right there. All right, that's the same. Now, let me see. Is this in here? Let me check this out. I'm not sure that's playing. Okay, so I guess that if you go out to YouTube, you can watch this video. Back in 2015, I did a time lapse standing in that bend of the serpent, fixed camera right in the center to watch the sun come up right through the center of that bend. I've done this for a number of the sunrises and sunsets. If you go out to YouTube and you just type in Serpent Mound time lapse vernal equinox, you'll be able to find it. You can watch that. So we'll just sort of skip that at this point. So here's your vernal equinox sunset through that center bend right to the sun on the horizon. Here's this is a kind of an interesting shot, because oftentimes during the summer solstice, I've had a lot of shots in the fog in the mornings, and that was the case here. So it's a little hard to see, but I'm going to throw that line up there. You can see that bend, and there it is. There's your alignment line with the fog, and making for a nice, pretty picture. What you'll notice also is you see these hills in the distance that run along the whole sort of deep horizon. That is the rim of the meteor crater. All right. And this piece sort of in the front is part, not the whole, but is part of what's known as the central uplift in the middle of the crater. Serpent Mound is sort of in the southwest edge of the crater. All right. So the crater is about 5 miles in diameter, and we're sort of in the southwestern edge.
So it's a complex crater.
It's fairly circular. It's a little oval. So
When did that go down? When did the crater?
about 200 million years ago, give or take.
Before the big one.
Okay.
Before the one that went into Mexico.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so this was before.
Yeah.
All right.
In fact, at the time, this was a shallow ocean, and there wasn't any land here. So that's how long it's been with continental drift and everything. So
Kind of get that in my.
yeah. So again, there's another time lapse. This is one for the summer solstice. I just don't think those are in here. I think I took them out for whatever reason. But here's your summer solstice sunrise. I'm not sure we're going to do it tonight, but tomorrow night for sure, and probably Sunday night as we get closer to the sunset, I am going to put my drone up, and we're going to project it so people will be able to watch it here. So, because if you go over to Serpent Mound now, they refuse to cut the trees, and so if you try to go see that alignment, you can't even see it. It's totally obscured by the forest canopy. So they have said that they're over the weekend they're going to be open until 9 o'clock. Now the thing is that sunset's about 9:06. So I don't know if they're going to kick people out 5 minutes ago before the sun sets, or I don't know what they're doing. But in any event, it'll be open later.
Why are they so reticent to take those trees out?
Well, for about 10 years, the Ohio History Connection subcontracted the management of the site to a forest preserve organization, and they didn't want to cut any of the trees down. In the management plan that was developed for Serpent Mound, I was a part of those meetings. We advocated for the archaeological authenticity of the site, which in everybody's mind was, well, you got to be able to cut the trees to see the alignments because that's part of the site. But that has never been acted upon. So
In ancient times, there weren't trees. They didn't let the trees grow.
more than likely, yeah. No, right. Well, even 100 years ago, there were no trees out here. There are photographs of all this area, and there was very, very little trees in this area 100 years ago. Most of what you see over at Serpent Mound was intentionally planted by the OHC in a decorative tree planting project between like 1906 and 1915. And so they planted all kinds of decorative hardwoods to make it a more park-like setting. And so that's the legacy of the trees that are there today, all those big trees. But, you know, I mean, we've advocated for, hey, just clear this little line of trees here so that you can see where the sun comes down and everybody will be able to see it. But they're kind of reticent to even allow people to go out and see any of the alignments. So, you know, for the last couple of years, they've kept the park closed or restricted during those periods of time so people couldn't even do it. And fortunately, this year they had announced that the park was going to be open 1 extra hour early and 1 extra hour late, which meant instead of 10 to 5, it was going to be 9 a.m. to 6. And everybody was like, well, that's kind of pointless because, you know, sunrise is at 6 a.m. and sunset's at 9 p.m. So they decided to because of the criticism, they opened it up a little bit. But it's like pulling teeth. You know, they don't want to really do it. So it costs them money to keep that open, pay all those people to stand around, right? There's your autumnal equinox sunrise. It's the same as the vernal equinox sunrise, just more leaves on the trees, right? And so there's that. There's your sunset, same thing, more leaves on the trees. And then here you go for the winter solstice sunrise. That's the one that kind of points almost towards where the museum is, but just to one side of the museum. And there's your sunrise there. And then you have winter solstice sunset again through that last bend of the serpent before you get to the spiral tail, through the center of the tail, right to the sunset, right there. All right. So here's the photo that I took in 2014, showing that alignment right through the center. All right. And
Yeah, that's a postcard.
yeah. There is a time lapse of that if you want to go out onto YouTube and watch that. All right, so back to our Lidar image of Serpent Mound. Here's Romaine's north line again, and here are all the lunar alignments that Bill Romaine had mapped out back in 1987. So again, using those bends in the Serpent, maximum southern moon set all the way to minimum northern moon set, and the same thing for the rises on the opposite side. All right. To look at that just another way, if you stand in sort of that central place along that central northern alignment, you can kind of figure out where those moon rises are going to be. All right.
Is that a place you can actually stand?
So that's a great question. And that leads me into another part of the talk. For many years, this puzzled me. I used to talk about why would the people who built Serpent Mound incorporate all of these astronomical alignments into the design of it, but not give you that central location to actually view it, because it's like off the cliff, right? It's down the hill. And it took me a while to sort of come upon a reasonable answer for that. And it was really through some research that I did at Harvard University. I went back and looked at every single record that Frederick Putnam made during his period of time at Serpent Mound. And I found 2 maps that he had made that are unpublished. And on one of those, I think I found the answer for that. And I'll get to that here in a minute. So if you were to put all those together, let's see, we got our north line there, and then here's all the solar lines and the lunar lines, right? Now, one of the things that I did when I did my first project, which was back in 2004, I wanted to confirm this alignment that Clark and Marjorie Hardman had done. And when I did that, as I was photographing that, I noticed after the sun had set that there was a planet there. And that planet was essentially setting on the same alignment during the same night. About 20 minutes later, it turned out to be Venus.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
And so that Venus sunset alignment that I documented back in 2004 led me to sort of a bit of an insight, and maybe only astronomers would have thought about this. But wherever you have a solar alignment, you have a planetary alignment, because all the planets revolve around the sun. And so this week, there is kind of an alignment of 5 planets, right? They're all sort of spaced out apart in the sky. Well, they're all along what's known as the plane of the ecliptic. The plane of the ecliptic is the path that the sun goes across the sky. And so all those planets follow that path across the sky as well. Some slightly up and down, not too much, within a couple of degrees. So it turns out that if you have a sun alignment, you also have any of the visible planet alignments can fall along those. So not just Venus, but Mercury, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter. And it turns out that I had seen, I'm gonna come back to this here in a second. So I had seen, this was the 2004 shot that I had taken a sequence of photos to show that alignment. And you can see, even back then it was difficult to see where that sun was coming down. Those trees have now completely covered that view. And this was just about 20 minutes later. I don't know if it really shows up there, but where that green circle is, there's Venus. Now, between Venus and where the sun set, Mercury was out there. And so I didn't know that until I looked it up on an astronomical program. And yep, Mercury was out there too. And so was Saturn, just following behind it. And so that night that I shot in 2005, you had the sun set, Mercury, Venus, Saturn, all in the same alignment, same night. Okay. Now, if you looked at that, again, 25 minutes after sunset, that's, they're right there going on the alignment right down there. Now, if you turned around and looked in the opposite direction along the same alignment, you had the full moon coming up on the opposite direction. And so sometimes that can occur, is you can have these sort of moon alignments along with your sun alignments, but just because, because the moon is following basically almost a similar path, it moves up and down that line about 5 degrees swing either way. And I might get to that here in a second. So let me go back a couple, because I also found another interesting atmospheric phenomenon that may have an alignment at Serpent Mound. Anybody ever hear of sun halos? Okay. So this is a picture that I put in as sort of an animation of sun halos, right? The ones that are on either side, sometimes they call them sun dogs, right? But this is a phenomenon, it's called a 22-degree sun halo. And you have this feature up here called the dragon's eye. All right. Well, I had read a paper that was written by a former scientist from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory who had postulated that at Stonehenge, this effect could occur when, particularly farther back you go in time, when there were more ice crystals in the atmosphere and the atmosphere was cooler during certain climactic period changes. These effects are produced by hexagonal ice crystals in the upper atmosphere. As the sun hits them, they refract on that hexagonal ice crystal, and it creates that arc in the sky of refraction of light. Well, he figured that if the sun was coming up through the center doorway on the summer solstice, then the sun pillars on either side would come up in the adjacent windows. Well, after I read that, I thought, well, the same thing will happen at Serpent Mound. If the sun comes up through that center portion there, then you also have the sundogs that come up through the alignment at the same period of time, if there's a sun halo visible, right? So it's a fascinating phenomenon. I don't know if that has anything to do with Serpent Mound, but it's worthy of note anyways. So we'll skip back through this, and we'll get back to the other question about the standing point. All right. When I went to look through those records at Harvard, I think I have discovered the reason for why Serpent Mound's astronomical alignment center point is off the cliff. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Frederick Putnam. Putnam spent 4 years, 4 seasons, essentially summer seasons, excavating at Serpent Mound and reconstructing it. And at the end of those years, he then published the entire total of all the work that he did in a 12-page article in this popular magazine called Century Magazine. That's including illustrations and 2 pages that really didn't have anything to do with Serpent Mound at all. It was sort of comparative religion stuff. So he wrote very, very little about Serpent Mound. Yeah.
Is that a picture of the original head, or is that the picture of the head that they reconstructed?
Reconstructed. Okay. And this is his map that was in this article. Okay, April 1890. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but I came to find out that even though Putnam's article was published in April of 1890, he had actually written it and had sent it to the publisher at the end of April, beginning of May of 1889. And so there was a whole nother season of excavating that he had done after this article had even been published. And he never wrote anything about it, nothing. All right. But this is the map that he published, and he's got all these notations on here of different things that they discovered, and there's a key to it. And, Serpent Mound is there. And so that's what got published. Okay. What I found was better than this. So the first map I found was this map, which Putnam had made when Harvard first bought the property. This map was created to identify the property boundaries. And so it was well surveyed out exactly where the property boundaries were. All these dots that you see, he had identified where every single tree was, what kind of tree it was or shrub it was. He noted where all the large stones were in the landscape, and a bunch of other things that he found in the park. And so there's all kinds of notations, including some historical burials that had headstones in the park. Those are long vanished. Nobody knew about those until I found this notation here. Lots of stuff, lots of interesting stuff. The second map was done after he had completed all those excavations, and it's much more similar to the published map. You can see the outer oval is now gone, and now, so part of the oval seems to have vanished. He doesn't include the second mound that's on the south side of the head of the serpent, but there's all kinds of other notations on this map, all of the things that they discovered in various places. Now the map is kind of coming apart. You can see holes in the map where it was all folded together and everything. I spent months working with Harvard to get this digitized because it had never been digitized. I had to pay hundreds of dollars for them to get it to a place that had a large enough scanner to actually scan the entirety of the map in one go. And so I then put this out in a paper that I wrote. It's out on Academia if you really want to know. So just to compare the two serpents that from the mounds, you can see some changes here. There was a feature, you can barely see it right there at the head of the serpent, and then these features on the north and south side were linear features connected to serpent. Afterwards, after the excavations, a lot of those features are now gone. So Putnam did some significant redesign of the head of the serpent area, and it's unclear why he decided to do that. But nevertheless, if you were to compare a couple of other earlier maps, these were the last two surveys that had been done prior to Putnam's excavations. 1885, J.P. McLean, and 1886, D.H. Holmes, both sponsored by the Smithsonian. And you can see all those additional features that all sort of disappear, right? So let's go back to this map and let's zoom in almost right to the center of the map. I found this feature. You can guys see this sort of dotted line structure here, double dotted line structure. Well, right here, there's a notation about what that is. It says black dots are post holes. Okay, what does that mean? That's a big structure, right? Double row of posts all the way around in a circle. What is that? Okay, what's that? Yeah. Also, I'll note here, this mound right here is the tiny little conical mound next to the current picnic shelter. Okay, it's basically at the center point of that. It's just slightly offset. So there's our black dots of post holes. There's the circle. Okay. Here's your center point. Now, depending on which circle you use, it's slightly offset. Nevertheless, this section of the pathway over here was right along part of the map that was kind of messed up, and so it's hard to see it. But this pathway right here, Putnam put in to lead to the Serpent Mound, and that goes right through that area and kind of may have destroyed their understanding of what might have been there, right? So if you were to put that on a modern satellite shot, I was able to do that because Putnam had so carefully mapped the property boundaries and had them surveyed on those maps. This is where that double ring would have been. It's that large, it would have been way bigger than that picnic shelter that's over there, well into the parking lot, so on and so forth. It's about a little over 300 feet in diameter. The inner circle about 307 feet, the outer circle about 353 feet. Okay? And so that's what we're looking at, right?
Do you know the circumference of the one at Cahokia?
I'll get to that here in a second. So my hypothesis was that what this was and what Putnam had uncovered was a wood henge, which at the time nobody knew what that was, right? The first wood henge was uncovered at Cahokia back in the mid-70s. And, you know, it's kind of west of Monk's Mound if you've ever been to Cahokia. Well, a couple of them have now been found in Ohio. The first one that was found in Ohio is this one down here at the Stubbs Earthworks. That was discovered by a construction worker running a bulldozer. They were making a new high school over about 5 miles south of Fort Ancient. And the earthworks were known to be there, but everybody thought that they were just obliterated or gone. They were known to have been mapped in that area back in the mid-1800s. And this bulldozer operator bulldozing this line noticed that there was kind of this weird circle of or kind of an arc of circles where he had just bulldozed. And he stopped the bulldozer, and they called an archaeologist in. And that turned out to be Frank Cohen from the Cincinnati Museum Center. And they did an emergency excavation, and they found 172 posts, 271 feet in diameter. So that's smaller than the one here by about 50, 60 feet, but nevertheless similar in size, right? Fairly comprehensive, 172 posts. That now is underneath, I think, the football field. That's obliterated. That was the salvage excavation. The second one that was discovered was this one up here, which has now become known as the Moorhead Circle. That is inside of Fort Ancient. The Ohio History Connection at the time was doing some erosion mediation project, and they hired Dr. Jared Burks, a private archaeological company firm, to go and do a magnetometer survey of the area. And when he did that, they found this circle of posts, and it turns out 200 feet in diameter, over 200 posts. It seems to be aligned to the summer solstice sunrise. And there's some archaeologists that spent about a decade working and excavating that, and I think they finally completed that project. The third one that was found was in 2006, discovered by archaeologist Jennifer Pedersen Weinberger over inside the Hopewell Earthworks. And this one is 375 feet in diameter, 108 posts, so bigger than the one here, but certainly less posts than these other two, right? Nevertheless, it had a couple of gateways that are aligned to summer solstice sunset and some other alignments. And this work was done by Jared Burks, Brett Ruby, and Bill Romaine. Brett Ruby is the archaeologist at the National Park Service, Hopewell Culture National Park. And so they have spent some time documenting this. Jared Burks has excavated a couple of these center features over the course of the last 6-7 years. And so they've been identifying this. Now, these are kind of the standard sizes, of wood henges. Even the ones that have been found at Cahokia are roughly all in this sort of ballpark. But more recently, about 5 years ago, the National Park Service entered into a partnership agreement with the German Archaeological Institute, who had just completed this massive magnetometer survey of the Stonehenge area. And they had all kinds of success there. So they came over to do some magnetometer surveys of some of the Hopewell sites in and around Chillicothe. And one of the sites that they did was the Hopewell Earthworks, which is this giant circle connected to this weird kind of shaped square down here. And this is their magnetometer survey. And it turns out that this giant circle, 1,053 feet in diameter, is now the world's largest identified wood henge, because there was a whole series of wooden posts that went around the entire thing. Okay? So, the bigger you make the circle, the more accurate you can make your alignments, I guess. And this is part of the excavation that Brett Ruby did to confirm the post hole. So it's not just the magnetometer survey. The posts were set in about every 20 feet.
It tells you where to dig.
Yeah, it does. That's right. All right, so going back to this one, how does it tell us anything about why Serpent Mound is laid out the way it is? Well, this is a kind of a wider lidar map view of the area, and this is the area that we'd be looking at for where that circle would have been. Now, there's no real trace on lidar because lidar just looks at kind of the surface features, but this whole area, over the course of the last 150 years or so, has been really torn up. I came across this photo, one of the early aerial photos of Serpent Mound, and you can see how many buildings used to be in that area. I started numbering them. It turns out that over the historical time frame, there's something on the order of 22 buildings that existed in this area. So if there's anything left of that, it would be chance for certain. But this is a photo taken by Captain Dash Reeves, published in Scientific American in 1936. All right. So.
He must have been up in an airplane.
Yeah, he was one of the first aerial photographers of archaeological sites. And so when I was doing this work, mapping out where that was, it struck me that, well, this curvature right here seems to be awfully similar to the curvature here. And so I basically copied these circles here and dropped them down so that the convergence point of all the sunrise alignments, for simplicity's sake, that's where that convergence point is. If I centered the circles on that convergence point, lo and behold, what happens? Well, it defines the curvature of Serpent Mound. So, to give it another view here, you can see that these two circles define the width of Serpent Mound and basically show exactly that curvature, where that layout is. And it's based on that center convergence point where all those alignment lines come together. So that's why I think that we figured out the reason why it's off the edge of the cliff is because they made all their observations here, and they then took that knowledge and incorporated it into the design over here without having to have that place to stand and see them. Because really, Serpent Mound isn't necessarily there for us 2,000 years later to come and sit and watch those alignments. What they were trying to do was to incorporate Serpent Mound in so that it's integrated into their environment. It's integrated into the world. And so they already knew that this stuff was there. It's there so that Serpent Mound is a part of the natural world, right? And so I think they made all their observations at the Woodhenge, then just took that and dropped it in over there. All right. So the question then remains, well, we have solar alignments, we have lunar alignments, we have planetary alignments. Are there celestial alignments at Serpent Mound? Well, there's been a handful of people that have tried to figure that out. The first person I found a record of that tried to figure that out was George Herbert Cooper in a book written in 1921 called Ancient Britain, the Cradle of Civilization. And in that book, he says that many of the earthworks in the Ohio Valley correspond to constellations in the sky. And he named Serpent Mound and its potential celestial design as the constellation of Serpens. And he's kind of got this weird thing showing Polaris up in the sky versus where Serpens is. He's not showing any alignment there. All he's saying is that the star pattern seems to match the way that Serpent Mound is. No alignment per se, but I like this quote from the book. But here is indisputable proof that the serpent form is taken from the sky and forms part of the ancient sky divinity worship, which includes the solar system as well as the visible constellations. Confident, isn't he? Yeah. Not a lot in the way of evidence, though. One of our speakers tomorrow, Ross Hamilton, wrote a book about Serpent Mound in the mid-1990s called The Mystery of Serpent Mound. And as he was preparing to write that book, he serendipitously had a transparency of the constellations of the North Celestial Pole area. So Big Dipper, Little Dipper, Cassiopeia, all those. And so he happened to lay it down over Romaine's map of Serpent Mound. And he was like, oh, well, Serpent Mound seems to be like the constellation of Draco. And so it turns out that just about every star, almost up to this point in the constellation of Draco, falls on the body of the serpent, with the exception of this star right here, which is Alfred Chiconis. Anybody have any idea why Alfred Chiconis is important? So a few thousand years ago, Alfred Chiconis was the North Celestial Pole Star. Today it's Polaris. but in the intervening millennium, as precession happens, the sky moves about 1 degree every 80 years or so. We go around this big, long circle in the sky. It takes 26,000 years to complete that cycle, roughly. And that, at one point, several thousand years ago, was that North Celestial Pole. And so it turns out, Ross identified along with this, is that that location is the actual midpoint of Serpent Mound. It is the same distance from there to the tip of the serpent as the tip to the tip of the tail. And just so happens that our central location of all those solar and lunar alignments, well, guess what's that? Well, that's the bowl of the Little Dipper right there, right? That's kind of an interesting bit. And so Ross sort of put forward this hypothesis that, well, maybe Serpent Mound is laid out like the constellation of Draco. So I mentioned the sort of bit about the change of the North Pole star over a long period of time. That's called precession. And this is sort of a diagram showing that. Vega was even farther back or farther in the future, depending on your turn around the circle. Whoops. So this is a graphic that Ross put together that just sort of shows that again a little bit. And he has kind of run with this idea. And the other thing that Ross found was so here is Romaine's Polaris line. He found an additional parallel line that would run right through there, and that would go through that pole star. And so if you're trying to figure out where north is, it might make some sense to put down a marker in the ground so that if you go along that parallel path, you might, figure it out. And so maybe it wasn't from the tail through the head, maybe it was along the body, but nevertheless, they're parallel. Now, I don't know if I want to get into this because this is really complicated, but based on Romaine's observations of lunar alignments at Serpent Mound and Ross's work on there may be a connection with Draco, being an astronomer, I remember when I took observational astronomy 20, 30 years ago, my professor at the time, spending quite a bit of time talking about something called Draconic Months. And that refers to, I mentioned earlier, that the moon moves above and below the sun's path of the ecliptic, moves above the line and below the line. And as it goes back and forth, it oscillates and cycles back and forth. People can track that. Astronomers today, they don't pay hardly any attention to that kind of stuff. But back in the day, they did. And it's now really only used by astrologers. Astrologers kind of still track Draconic months because they want to know whether the moon is above the ecliptic or below the ecliptic. And so if it's going up and above the ecliptic, they call that an ascending Draconic. And if it's going down and below, it's descending Draconic. These are all really arcane nonsense, astronomy things. But nevertheless, it turns out that there are certain places along the moon's cycle known as lunar nodes. And if you track those, we call those Draconic months, 255 of those is equal to about 6,939 point some days. And that is the same as 254 sidereal months or lunar orbits, which is the same as 235 synodic months or lunar phases, which is the same as 19 tropical years of the sun. All about 6,939 and a portion days. And in Greeks' time back when they're 400 or so BC, Meton of Athens figured out this one, and they began to use that to figure out lunar eclipses. And so finding that there are lunar alignments of tracking northernmost, midpoint, and southernmost, and that there's this association with Draco, I had this hypothesis that maybe Serpent Mound could have been used to track lunar eclipses. It's just a hypothesis. I don't have all of the information there, but nevertheless, it's a possibility, and there hasn't been any data to sort of rule it out at this point. But if you were going along those alignment lines from northern moonrise down to southern moonrise, you have the range of the moon during a major standstill and at a minor standstill. And those happen during different periods of time through the moon's 18.6-year cycle. And from that, you can then track where the moon will cross the path of the sun, and therefore your chance of having an eclipse, whether it's a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, right? Because that only happens when the moon is crossing the plane of the ecliptic. So if you're tracking, if it's down below the plane of the ecliptic or above the plane of the ecliptic, you can track where the eclipses are. And it appears that that could be done using Serpent Mound. Right. So there's Draco in the sky. Ross Ambleton put this together because Draco at one point was the centermost constellation in the northern sky. It would have remained up there all night long where Polaris sits today. The whole rest of the sky rotates around that, basically because the Earth rotates, and that's where the North Pole goes out into space. So at some period in time in the past, Thuban, or Alfred Chiconis, was on the path of where the North Star was. And essentially, what Meton figured out was, depending on what point in the cycle you are, Draco will point to the constellation throughout the year, and that's how they help to track the months. What period of time was the moon going through Leo, or the moon was going through Libra, or so on and so forth. They could use Draco as a pointer to that constellation to figure out where they were in the cycle. And so that's how they tracked it.
And this alignment is 3,000 years old, right?
Yeah,
Or older.
right.
So then the Serpent Mound.
Isn't that old? And it's not, it wasn't made by the Greeks either. So it came later, but the question then is, well, if they were using Draco to refer back to a time when Thuban was the North Star, what's going on? Now, I don't have that in this presentation because that's a whole separate presentation that I've been working on for a while, but I'll give you a little preview. Many people probably are familiar with the recent, back in 2012, ending of the Mayan calendar, right? So that was the end of a very long cycle of time. The beginning point of that cycle was when Thuban was the North Celestial Pole. And for the Mayans, the reason that they started the calendar at that point, even though Mayan culture was not in any sense, no archaeologists have ever figured out that it went back that far. What they were doing was they were calculating backward to a specific point in time. And before that date, 4113 BC, August something 27th, whatever it is, before that date, that was known as mythological time. After that date is the cycle of time that we lived in up to 2012. Okay, now we started a new cycle, right? Well, why did they mark that specific point in time? Well, the Mayans had their own constellations. They had their own ecliptic path constellations, like their own zodiac, right? And during precession, over long periods of time, the sun will move from one constellation to another, right? You've heard of the thing, we're now in the age of Aquarius, right? We were in the age of Pisces before, we shifted now into the age of Aquarius. Well, the Mayans seem to be tracking that as well. And that Mayan date, the start date, marks the shift from the Turtle constellation to the Serpent constellation. Okay? And so my hypothesis is perhaps all the peoples here in North America talk to each other for certain, right? There was no Trump wall on the border back then. So that knowledge was probably shared widely. And if it didn't come directly from the Mayans, it passed to somebody who also had that knowledge. And they were memorializing that date, right? The Mayans did a lot of that. They built memorials and then backdated to special sky events that happened, okay? So I have this hypothesis about Serpent Mound maybe playing a role. And why is it set to a certain date? Because they are starting the cycle of time at that date, right? Part of the Mayan calendar. Right. Yeah.
How did ancient man map the angles and the distances between those stars?
So that's a great question. We don't know for certain. However, in some of the Mayan codices, they identified that sort of Mayan priest astronomers had a tool, and they had drawings of these guys holding this tool that seemed to be measuring degrees in the sky. So astronomers have a tool that I used to teach in my astronomy labs that you make. It's called a T-stick. Essentially, you have a fixed distance. You have a measuring board. Yep. So a lot of astronomers use a thumb, right? So you hold it at that distance, and it has degree measurements on hashes going across, so you can measure how many degrees from one star to the next star to the, whatever you want to measure. And I think that something similar was probably being done.
What about a reflection? Today we look at our telescopes, our mirrors. We look into
Yes.
the mirror now. Ancient man could have had a pool of water.
Right. But the Mayans were also making mirrors out of obsidian. And whether they were using them for astronomy or not, don't know. They
A way to bring the celestial down to Earth.
right.
Measure angles and distances, and then you can project mathematically.
Right. So fairly recently, I think within the last 10 years, there was a site down in the Yucatan that was excavated by a professor at Boston University. And they discovered what appears to be the Mayan star priests workshop. And they found on murals inside of that some of the mathematical calculations, almost like they were writing on a chalkboard kind of thing, to figure out what some of these calculations would be. And they dated that to, I think it was about 50 BC. So that pushed back the earliest known dates that the Mayans were doing any of that stuff by over 100 years. And I suspect that it's been even longer than that knowledge was being used. They just happened to come upon something that was still intact that they found. The Olmec were already known to have developed the calendar before the Mayans, and they were using essentially the same calendar, at least the solar one. So the Olmec were, 800, 900 years or older than when the Mayans were known to have begun using that math and those, calendars and solar calculations. But it's pretty complicated, and very few people are studying it right now, and it's still kind of not very well understood. The best source of knowledge comes from the 4 remaining original Mayan codices. The Spanish rounded up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Mayan codices and burned them all, right? And so destroyed essentially a whole entire culture's worth of knowledge. And it's only been since about 1973 or 4 that people have pieced together enough information to start to read some of what we still have left. And so, you know, it's like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle, but you only have 7 pieces, you know, or 4 pieces, and you're trying to figure out what the whole thing is based on those few pieces, and it's really difficult. They're doing some amazing work down south of the border. Nothing like that is being done in the United States.
The Egyptians supposedly reflected where they put the pyramids from the belt of Orion, was it?
Right, yeah, that was I'm trying to remember the Adrian Gilbert's book that talked about that, Orion's book about it, but that's okay.
So the calendar, the Serpent Mound, those two coming together is from the 2012 in back calendar.
Correct. Yep. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the cosmology of Serpent Mound. And a lot of this was work that Bill Romaine had put together. So I'm going to borrow a little of his work. He wrote a book about the Hopewell back around the year 2000 called The Mysteries of the Hopewell, Bill Romaine. And a lot of this material was in there. He wrote a second book about sort of the prehistoric shamanism evidence that they found, and some of it kind of incorporates that. But there have been a bunch of anthropologists and archaeologists working on trying to understand what these ancient peoples were really thinking about doing with, you know, creating their artwork, what kind of structures they were building. And the picture, again, is like a jigsaw puzzle without all the pieces, and so it's kind of hard to tell. But one of the things that they seem to have centered on is this idea of quartering time and space. And so we have the plane of existence that we live on, and then there's this sort of what they call an axis mundi that goes up into the upper sky world and then down into the lower underworld. And then you have the path of the sun going around that, right? And so what happens is, based on that path of the sun, you can quarter the kind of your viewscape into 4 bits. And the upper sky world division is kind of ruled by or domain of the Thunderbirds, and the water underworld is the domain of the Great Horned Serpent, some of the tribes called the Underwater Panther. But essentially all the stories are roughly the same regarding those from tribes that lived here in the eastern woodlands. Now, one of the things about that is that there is a great amount of difference between function and purpose. So it has been said that a viewer who observes an equinox or a solstice is said to become the cosmic center of the universe, pinning the sky and the earth together with the 4 directions, thus becoming a symbolic witness to the actual first moment of creation. This precise point in time and space is a singularity. That's the actual Native American word translation. Now, the function of something was considered to be profane. So the idea that mound sites and medicine wheels are simply calendar sites, that would be a function that was considered to be profane. Purpose was what was profound, and that was to seek and maintain universal order on behalf of mankind. So this is an artifact that was pulled out of one of the Hopewell mounds, and that shows that sort of quartering of time and space. Now, as a part of our sort of existence of 3 planes of existence, these 2 beings, the Thunderbirds and the Horned Serpents, are sort of diametrically opposed to one another. There are a number of mythologies that anthropologists documented in the 1800s from different tribes, talking about how every year the Thunderbirds would set out into the 4 directions on a quest to kill the Great Horned Serpent. And if they could do it, they would shoot their fiery arrows of lightning at the serpent, and the only way they could kill it was if they shot those fiery arrows of lightning through the head of the serpent. If they were successful, the earth would be renewed for another year. Okay, and so this is a Hopewell era mica serpent with a pearl inlay. This was excavated out of the Turner Earthworks site just outside of Cincinnati in Claremont County. This is called the Bell Gorget, that was found in Texas, and depicting that great horned serpent Thunderbird battle. And if you notice carefully, you see that bend back and forth of that serpent right there. Now, for the most part, Ohio, back in the 1800s, forcibly removed the remaining tribes that were here. You can kind of thank Andrew Jackson for the Indian Removal Act and the enthusiasm of the government officials here in Ohio to force all those people out. But as a result of that, and the Trail of Tears down south, and the Potawatomi Trail of Death in Indiana, and so on and so forth, that tragic era of time really shattered a lot of the oral traditions and the continuity of those cultures. And so it's very difficult to piece a lot of that stuff back together. But one of the tribes that seems to have retained the most star knowledge are the Lakota and some of the tribes up in that part of the Dakotas. And this was a map that was given by that tribe to the Chicago Field Museum in the early 1900s, because the tribe at that time believed that they weren't going to be around very much longer, and they wanted somebody to preserve it. And so it wound up at the Chicago Field Museum. And this guy, Vondell Chamberlain, in 1982, wrote a whole book about this. It's called the Big Black Meteoritic Star Bundle. And it's essentially a star map. Now, there was a Lakota back in the mid-1980s, I think late in 1980s, who wrote kind of a book about his people's star knowledge. Ronald Goodman, it's called Lakota Star Knowledge, actually. And in it, he identifies their connecting of the stars to certain constellations in the sky. Now, those stars are depicted on this map, but one of the things that Vondell Chamberlain said in this book that includes this analysis of this star chart is that he says the most important were the star gods who at the discretion of Tirawahat planned and carried out the creation of the earth and the people. 4 of her assistants, lightning, thunder, wind, and clouds, actually carried out the original creation of life and renewed it each year. They were the gods of weather as well as life. Thunder, the voice of the mysterious being, was among the most important elements of Skidi mythology and was used in conjunction with observations of stars to set the calendar. Okay, so not only were they using sun, moon, they were also using stars to help set the calendar, right? And this is from Ronald Goodman's book. This is the Lakota star chart. And when I saw this, this is the Greek constellation of Draco. But if you look carefully, what do the Lakota identify that as? The Thunderbird. Okay. Now, why is that important? Well, if Serpent Mound is essentially the great horned serpent, but it's built on our plane of existence, right? You have the Thunderbirds are up in the sky, and the underwater serpent's down below us. So what actually is Serpent Mound? Well, I believe that Serpent Mound may actually be a fusion of the two. So the great horned serpent is down below, and that's the earth part that we see. But if it's laid out like the constellation of the Thunderbird, right? Like Ross thought it was laid out like the constellation of Draco, then what Serpent Mound is a fusion of the sky and the underworld together. And I think that this is a very appealing notion from the standpoint of understanding what Serpent Mound's purpose was, not its function. It has all those astronomical alignments constructed in its design, but that's not what it was used for. It's really a place to help people communicate with both the sky and the underworld. All right. So with this in mind, we start applying these concepts that the Native Americans have taught us, right? And we begin to understand philosophically what that purpose might have been. The function may have been to mark the movements of celestial objects and the passage of time, but they were built in such a way as to not be generally visible to a ground-based observer. The central point for most of the alignment observations are 30 to 40 feet above the ground surface. So Serpent Mound's purpose was instead as a place meant for those people and supernatural beings beyond our plane of reality where we could interface and communicate with them, right? So it all starts at a Woodhenge, right? So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions if you got them.